Can you imagine when you were in school doing science, reading science textbooks, learning about science vocabulary, and then trying to comprehend what the science textbooks are trying to say? And then you scratch your head and say, I don't understand. Now, if it presents challenges to many students who would say that either I don't understand or I do understand, but I don't know what it has anything to do with me or my family or my future. This approach presented a real challenges to students learning English as an additional language because the science is done in the written form. Science is done through vocabulary and grammar.
Welcome to RBERN Questions, a professional learning podcast where we answer your most compelling questions about teaching, serving, and supporting multilingual learners. I'm your host, Jasmine Coaxum, and through our talks, I look forward to bringing the methods, philosophies, and stories behind teaching multilingual learners to light. Let's get into the show. Okhee Lee is a professor in the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development at New York University. She is committed to advancing research, policy, and practice that promotes STEM and language learning for all students, particularly multilingual learners. Her work involves integrating science, language, and computational thinking with a focus on multilingual learners. Her latest work addresses justice-centered STEM education with multilingual learners by integrating multiple STEM subjects, including data science and computer science, to address societal changes using the case of the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, today on the RBERN Questions podcast, we have Dr. Okhee Lee, who is a professor at NYU Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. Now, you've already heard a little bit about her background from the recorded bio. And so now, as I usually do, I just like to tell a little bit of a backstory in terms of how we managed to put this session together. And basically, she was recommended by Tanya Rosado Barringer, who is actually part of the team who puts this podcast together. So it's really an honor to have you on the show today. And I am really very excited to dive into a lot of your work. But before we dive into details about that, please tell us about your current role in education.
So, as you mentioned, I'm a professor at NYU Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. Also, I'm the principal investigator of NYU SAIL Research Lab that I would like to talk about later. And then I'm involved in professional organizations here and there and play some roles in STEM education with a focus on multilingual learners.
Okay, and from what I understand, you were recently appointed to the National Science Foundation's Committee on Equal Opportunities in Science and Engineering for a 3-year term. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. That really was an honor. It's across the National Science Foundation, and we produce reports that go to the Congress.
Now, I always like to, in addition to like backstory of how we met or how we brought this session together, I like to hear people's backstories of how they got into this field because they're very varied, they're very rich. It's just very interesting to hear how people come into the field of teaching English language learners, multilingual learners. So please tell us about what has inspired you to be an educator.
All right. So just as some people may be curious about where is she from? So I'm from South Korea. It's a long story. But anyway, I came to the U.S. at some age, and I completed my doctoral degree in 1989. And then I moved to Miami. I think about Miami. When you do any research in Miami, it would automatically involve students from different languages and cultures. Now, the younger generation audience may have a hard time reimagining if I say something like in the early 1980s, when I say languages and cultures in science, people will say, what does language and culture have anything to do with science? Science is a science and period. I was trying to make the research on language and culture in science as a part of the national discourse, and I was very frustrated. And my senior colleague told me that, okay, keep doing what you do. In no time will people wake up and say, my students look different and sound different, and who has done research in this area? That was that.
Okay, and definitely it's taken quite some time, I must say, for that waking up to happen. But definitely, I want to say, really, ever since the pandemic is really when this all started coming more to the surface. And so I'm also curious because a lot of your work is about science, right? So, how did that interest even develop?
Well, a girl from South Korea after the Korean War doing science in the US is a whole different story. So I'm not going to go there. All right. So since I started my doctoral program, I have always been interested in research in the service of a policy and practice, because the policy and practice reach all students. So I have always been interested in the connections. Now, I'm saying that like I completed my doctoral degree in 1989. It's hard to say, which is what, 3 decades ago?
It's okay. We don't really need to, people don't really need to know, put math together and guess ages. No one needs to do all of that.
Because I'm talking about science and STEM, that's why I'm giving a little bit of a hard time. I'm talking about for about 2 decades when I was in the education research. Science standards focused on science knowledge or science content or what science is, the knowledge of science. Then science content is taught to students through, you can think of reading textbooks or teaching science from the textbooks. And then some students might be lucky to do science lab to confirm science concepts or apply science content to everyday examples. But science was more like those smart students who do science and move on to science disciplines. And science was, typically taught in science textbooks. Can you imagine when you were in school doing science, reading science textbooks, learning about science vocabulary, and then trying to comprehend what the science textbooks are trying to say, and then you scratch your head and say, I don't understand. Now, if it presents challenges to many students who would say that either I don't understand or I do understand, but I don't know what it has anything to do with me or my family or my future. This approach presented a real challenges to students learning English as an additional language, because the science is done in the written form. Science is done through vocabulary and grammar. And this is where the practices, I would say traditional practices of pre-teach, a front load of vocabulary before coming to science. Or you have to know the sentences or grammar to read science textbooks. That's where it came from. Because there is a knowledge typically codified in science textbooks. And to do science or to learn science from the textbooks, you have to know the vocabulary and you have to know the grammar. So you can see why science was such a challenge for students.
So, definitely the old way, let's say, of having students learn science was certainly challenging for students whose first language wasn't English. But I'm wondering, what were some of the biggest challenges and then the greatest moments of progression in terms of integrating this language learning and science learning?
So you can see that the biggest challenge for the students would be that language, which should be the means of communicating about science, is actually a barrier. Because if you have English, you can. But if you don't, you cannot. So that's what we could say, a deficit model. That you have to know English, and if you don't. Now, in the field, we used to use the term limit English proficient students. And that's where it came from. According to the No Child Left Behind of 2001, you are limited English proficient, which changed later to English learners. Students are learning English as an additional language. I know some people may think of it as still deficit because the norm is English rather than speaking multiple languages. And that's where we are going. It's going in the right direction. So around early 2010, the new science standards were released. And new science standards really flipped the traditional approach to the contemporary approach. And you may say, why is it a contemporary approach? Because the science standards used to be that there is a body of knowledge. But the new science standards are saying students are doing science and language as a scientists and engineers do in the professional work. So students are not receiving the science knowledge anymore. Students are engaging in science and engineering to construct the knowledge. So that's where the science as a doing science or science in use or what science and knowledge it does for a purpose. So you can see the flip of from learning science to doing science. Now, that was 2013, and currently about 29 states in the nation either completely adopted the standards or made adaptations of the standards to develop their own state standards. As you can see, that's a whole nation. Don't ask me about one state that is not part of that movement. All right, that's a mystery. Between 2013, when the new standards came out, and then for some time, there was a bit of a gap. The science standards were saying students are doing science, but the language education, according to the English language development standards, is saying that students are learning the vocabulary and students are learning the grammar. And when you look into it, it says that even though it says a can-do philosophy, what it tells is that if you are proficiency level 1, you actually have to do basically draw, label, or color because you don't have English. That is the deficit that language proficiency was associated with a cognitive ability, that if you're limited in English or if you don't, then you are limited in ability. You can see that deficit model that we didn't think about. So in 2018, there was a consensus study called the English Learners in STEM Subjects. And what the consensus study by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine did was that as the students are doing science, students are using language. So it's for the purpose, doing science, using language. And so there was that more alignment between science and language. And what really happened is WIDA 2020 that came out, just a couple of years ago. And WIDA is saying that students are doing the content learning, and then students are using language in the service of doing content learning. That's where the alignments comes in. Now you can say that the content area, including science and STEM, and language learning are aligned in the sense of the content in the service of doing science, and language in the service of learning the science or doing science. So that's where we are. And you may want to know, how would I know that? I would like to just interject a little bit about myself.
Okay.
I know a thing or two about all the things that I mentioned here. because I was a member of the writing team of the science standards. And I was a leader of the science standards with a focus on diversity and equity.
Well, now I just want to make sure I'm looking at my notes, but this is the NGSS writing team. Is that what we're talking about? The Next Generation Science Standards writing team that you were part? Okay, fantastic. Okay.
And when it comes to diverse student groups, I was the leader of the team of writers working on science standards for all students. So we call the title All Standards, All Students, including multilingual learners. Right. I also was a writer of the consensus report that I just mentioned of English learners in STEM subjects. And I also did some work for WIDA 2020. So I think I know a thing or two about what has been happening since 2012, 20.
I think it's more than just a thing or two. I think it's like expert level at this point. I just, for our listeners, want to highlight a little bit about this next generation science standards. Basically, these standards highlight that when provided with equitable learning opportunities, students from diverse backgrounds are capable of engaging, which is a key word, I think, engaging in scientific practices and constructing meaning in both science classrooms and informal settings. And some of the students, so I understand that you actually co-edited this book, NGSS for All Students, correct?
Thank you.
And in this statement, okay, that's explaining some of the highlights of NGSS, it talks about students, the importance of high quality science education for economically disadvantaged students from major racial and ethnic groups, students with disabilities, English language learners, girls, students in alternative education, and gifted and talented students. It really encompasses everybody, which is the whole point, right? It's the whole point of that title, NGSS for all students. And I think it's an initiative, or it's something that is very impressive, but also that's been needed for quite some time. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work with this team in terms of editing this book, etc.?
All right. So you can see that it's a work of love, and we are very proud of that. It's all standards, all students, including multi-English learners at the time. What is important about this here, let me just say a couple of things about the science standards. One is that you can see the gap between what science standards are expecting of all students, but then at the time, English learners were pulled out of the science classrooms to learn some basic English. And I was thinking, that doesn't make sense because all students are doing science. You may say, how all students, including multilingual learners, are doing science according to the NGSS? The approach is flipped, completely different from the traditional. We are talking about traditionally students who are reading about science textbooks, and vocabulary and grammar played a key role. And if you do not have the science vocabulary or grammar or knowledge, you are out. The new science standards are saying that all students are doing science by, how would I say, explaining why something happens in nature. It's explaining the phenomenon. Or designing solutions to problems. That's the point. It's not about can you read. It's about what ideas do you have. And once you have the ideas, you can talk in your home language. You can talk with the gestures. You can draw. So in this case, drawing and just the labeling is not a deficit because you don't speak English. But drawing and develop model is just like what a scientist does. Now let me see how this works. The arrow here goes the cause and effect of something direction. Here it's moving. There is a body system. I'm drawing the body, and here are the organs. So I am expressing, communicating my ideas by doing the drawing. that drawing is not a deficit, I don't speak English, but drawing is the ways to communicate. So if you're learning English as an additional language, you can do very sophisticated computational models of a drag here, and this is how the virus is moving with speaking just little English. Do you see it? When you design a solution, how do you build a bridge? My bridge is the strongest. Do you need English? No. As long as my bridge stands the strongest, that's how I win. Students are doing science by asking questions, developing models of here it is, and then I'm arguing, no, your data do not show, my data show. So they are arguing. So they are explaining all of that. And then students once they have the idea, and once they ask a question, they will say, I'm doing science, and then I'm constructing. So one example that we did later on that I will say a little more, is that one unit in our 5th grade curriculum is what happens to our garbage. It could be physical science of garbage disappears, meaning decomposes, and then the aromatic smell of a banana becomes a rotten, bad smell. It could be physical science.
Yes.
Something happened.
Yes.
Chemical reaction. Or it could be earth science of the ecosystem of when banana gone, nothing left. Or
Yes.
decomposes. So that's a science word. Then it goes into, so it could be life science. Then you could think of that plastic in the garbage that does not decompose. Then what happens? Then the plastic pollutes the environment. It is earth science. Do you see it? That's the phenomenon that students are asking.
I think this is a little bit synergetic because actually I just finished teaching an environmental course to English language learners at Columbia University. And a lot of them, they were scared of this topic, because they were like, environmental what? Like, they were a little trepidatious in terms of how they were going to approach it, what their project was going to be about, and also understanding this new lingo, right? The new set of language around this. But as we did tactile things like go to a fabric factory where the fabrics are being separated, etc., then they could have more of a sense of, oh, okay, yes, I'm helping the environment by doing this and not just letting these scraps just float away somewhere. We also talked about this whole degradation of, or should I say, the fact that most plastic does not degrade or takes forever to degrade. So I think it's really interesting that you happen to mention that, because I can definitely resonate with that situation because I just had it with my student. Yeah.
Excellent. So let's continue that. I will say that the NGSS are the starting point. But when you think about the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, pollution, the environmental literacy, and then it becomes justice. Because when you think about those societal challenges that affect the society, who are disproportionately more affected by those challenges, minoritized groups and minoritized communities. So when you address STEM in the service of the societal challenges, then all multiple STEM subjects come together. And then you realize, why are those challenges impacting minoritized groups and communities more than the society? And so you can see that justice is baked in.
Now, I also would like to talk a little bit about one of the blogs that you wrote, Teacher Professional Development Programs Integrating Science and Language with Multilingual Learners was the title of this blog. And there were quite a few things there that struck me. And one of them, there's this really gorgeous chart that's part of the blog so that you can really make connections between traditional and contemporary perspectives. And on the chart, it says language learning is an outcome of effective content learning. And I think for a long time, people were thinking in the opposite way. But to me, this only makes sense because even as a native English speaker, I learned more vocabulary in my language through the concepts that I was being taught about, right? So we all learn language through experience in the home, experience in the school and in our social circles. So why should it be any different when we're talking about multilingual students?
That's exactly the point. So it's not English as a precursor or prerequisite to do science. Instead, you are doing science like a scientist because you have a question about the phenomenon that you wanted to solve. And so bring all modes of communication and all funds of knowledge that you have, and then solve the problem or explain the phenomenon. And by doing science, you are using language. And by using language, you are learning language. It's a complete flip. So what you just said, having the experience, to have the experience, something that is compelling to me, I wanted to figure out because it is important to me or to my family or to my community. And then that phenomenon, the problem is compelling to me. And I bring all my experience and I do science. And then I learn science. I use language. I learn language, just like you said. You summarize it beautifully. That's the contemporary approach of integrating science and language, like that. I think what has happened is that this mindset that I am a scientist and I'm a science educator, or I am a teacher, or I'm an adult, and you little people, you do not know. So I need to teach you. And I'm telling you. So we bring all the things that we think are important without thinking about whether what we consider important are really important or matter to our students. Now with English learners, or what we used to call limited English proficient students, now because Okhee is a limited English, that means that she cannot speak, never mind the reading and writing. So I have to give her what she's lacking. That's a deficit. They do not know that I could be brilliant. I could be really have great ideas that I can do. It's just that I'm learning English as an additional language. Think of that. This is what my example of the deficit that limited English students with disabilities, young kids, you just do not know. And the change is that we need to think of what Okhee brings to school. This is a neurodiversity, students with what we call disabilities, students with diverse abilities, kids who have great ideas, who should ask questions, but we say, no, we have to learn this. So the same idea, we used to have standards. These are the standards, you must learn standards because you are going to be tested. This time, these standards are important because these standards represent the science disciplines. But the starting point is your idea.
Now, what you just said ties into another a quote that I got from this blog that really speaks to this point. I mean, it says that our PD program is guided by 3 design principles. Students bring assets, teachers bring assets. Students figure out, teachers figure out. And students develop understanding over time. Teachers develop understanding over time. So this sounds like it creates a very equitable playing field, like a partnership between teachers and their students, as opposed to what you were just saying a moment ago, which was more of a hierarchical, yes, I know much more than you type of approach. And again, definitely was needed.
Thank you for doing the research. So we apply that approach of asset-oriented or equitable to our students, the 5th grade students. And after 9 weeks, they really explain the garbage has properties of food and non-food, but the smell is made of particles that move freely. But then there is a new substance, which is a garbage smell, and it went through chemical reaction. It's a new substance. And then banana decomposes and become part of the ecosystem, but plastic pollutes the environment and kills ocean animals. So they learn all those things in plain English, and then they just add a more sophisticated language over time. So it's asset-based. So we apply the same idea with the teachers. Now, again, we are debunking the traditional approach that because I do research, I know better. Or because I'm a policy person, I determine the standards and policy. Instead, we just say the same thing. You have been working with the children, and you know the children. Here are the ideas and standards or whatever. What would you do with this? So they will say the way I would do. Now, because the science instruction and language instruction is different, as you just said, why didn't we do that before? It's new to them. So the teachers will have to go through the same thing of that garbage. We had actually a teacher who was a mechanical engineer, somebody. And she would say, I know science. And until at the end of a couple of days of professional development, she said, who thought that garbage is such compelling? We don't think about it. So the teachers will go through the same experience of what is this smell so that they have an understanding of what the students are going through. And then they also say that, oh, I'm sorting garbage here and there. And then eventually they will say, oh, I am looking at the patterns of materials of garbage based on their properties. So they will learn the sophisticated science terms, just like a student. So we all go through the same process. If you ask me about how long it took for us to develop the garbage unit, several years, because we did not know what we're doing. And the only way we learned is because the teachers will say, that doesn't make sense, that works, I understand, let me try it with my students. And my students get it, no, my students don't get it. All right, we just flip it. And so this is a new language for all of us. Assets.
Now, I just want to clarify for our listeners, because you mentioned SAIL, right? So this is what you're talking about now, the year-long fifth grade science curriculum. And SAIL stands for Science and Integrated Language. And you were maybe just talking about some of the components of the curriculum, but I just want to make sure that the listeners also know that this was developed in collaboration with New York State Education Department. And then if there are some more elements or some more components of this science curriculum that you developed that you would like to dive into for us.
Thank you for asking. So SAIL, it's a sailing through in the ocean. It's a earth system, earth science. And then sailing through in the space, it's a sailing, the space sailing. We're sailing through. It actually started with the funding from the National Science Foundation. So you can imagine that the National Next Generation Science Standards were released in 2013. And we just had a mantra that science standards should be accessible to all students, including multilingual learners. So we convinced the National Science Foundation that we are the right people to develop the curriculum. So we worked with the teachers who are part of the standards writing team. We also worked with applied linguists and radical physicists to do the garbage as a physical science, and the teachers. So it's a team of scientists, science educators, and applied linguists between NYU and Stanford. So we worked across the coastline of bringing the two together. So it started from 2015, and it continues even now. That what you said about the professional development is, so you can see that we have been on it for a decade, and we hope to be on. Now, what happened is that, so we developed the fifth grade curriculum for all students with a focus on multilingual learners. And then New York State developed our own science standards and released in December of 2016. And New York State Science Standards is called the New York State, the P through 12 Science Learning Standards, are very close to the Next Generation Science Standards, very close. So when we were in the midst of developing the fifth grade curriculum, we were just so honored that New York State Education Department reached us and saying, please make the science standards accessible to multilingual learners. Can you develop the resources for educators in the community of how science is accessible with LIM? So that's how it started. So I would like to thank Elisa, the Assistant Commissioner Elisa Alvarez, who supported us. So it was done. I'm just grateful that it's collaboration between the New York NYU with the NSF funding initially. And then it was Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages, and then Office of Curriculum and Instruction Science. So it's a cross-disciplinary collaboration within the New York State Education Department where they learned from each other or one another, and we learned. That product, the resources got published on the New York State Education website across the OBEWL, and then curriculum and instruction. And it consists of what? The introduction and 7 webinars and topic briefs. And they are on the website. It's such an honor. My colleagues were very just envious of how did it happen that I get to work with. I get to work with the State Department, which is not common. It's a state policy. Now, what happened is that those resources that got translated into the CTLE, and we have teachers who are taking CTLE resources for CTLE credit. And then that project has been extended to work with your own colleagues, Tanya Rosado Behringer and Yanira Stoker of Mid-State RBERN, but also Chris Lees in the OCMBOCES of Voice Science. So we are again working with the language educators and science educators, working together across higher education and State Department and then the different districts. So that's how it came about. So the project is going strong, and that project also has been, 3 generations of years by now? So I'm very happy to speak with you, located at Mid-State RBERN and OCMBOCES.
Fantastic. Now, speaking of this whole kind of collaboration, working together to kind of achieve this goal of putting engagement up front, I know that you also appeared on the Conversations with Tim podcast, and I think Tim has something to do with the WIDA standards, correct? Yes,
correct?
good.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I got that correct. And I want to say that on that podcast, you talked about something else that I feel is maybe a bit more tied to the contemporary way of doing things. So a statement that was made is, so what you have in the 2020 edition, meaning the 2020 edition of WIDA, is that the first focus is multilingual learners, and then the second focus is multimodality. So this is definitely what I wanted to bring up, this concept of multimodality. So non-linguistic modalities, charts, tables, computational models, and gestures, right? And for me, I also wanted to add podcast and video, which is something that I like to facilitate in my classes with my university students. This whole idea of multimodality is very important because life is multimodal. So why not embrace this in our education system? And to me, it's basically the difference between seeing something like in 2D versus seeing it in 3D, right?
Thank you so much. You can see that when science standards came out and when language education committee was still pre-teach and front load, and they didn't gel together. It just was, one says one and the other says the other, and it just, so when I had a little bit to do with the WIDA 2020 because when I looked at WIDA 2012 from the perspective of science standards, and I was team leader focusing on diversity and equity, and I said, oh, wait a second. It says a Kendo philosophy. It's not just WIDA. It's the language education community in general, including Alpha 21 and others. It says a Kendo philosophy, but when you look at just open the cover of the document, cover of the page, it says that level 1 students are doing low cognitive ability work because you don't have English. It's the language is defined as a vocabulary and grammar. And when you don't have English, then you just have to sit in the back of the room and you color and you draw. And when you're level 2, you label. When you're level 3, you describe. When you're level 4, you analyze. And you're level 5 and level 6, you argue. And I say, I can argue even though I'm learning English as an additional language. Do you see that? And that's when I realized that the previous standards, language standards, are based on Bloom's taxonomy of a cognitive ability. The low-level proficiency, you do low-level cognitive work. Your high-level proficiency, you do high-level cognitive ability. Now, you may say that, why we didn't think about it? I don't know why. It just did not make sense to me. So I looked around and I asked the people, do you know why? And science educators will say, I don't understand. And language educators will say, I don't understand either. Because science and language do not talk to each other. Here comes, all right. I don't understand, I'm asking questions. Nobody seems to know. Maybe I shouldn't need to figure out. And then the next is, I think could have been me. And then it should have been me. So I raised the questions of why the proficiency level is equated with a cognitive ability, even though it says a can-do philosophy. As I say that at the time, limited English proficiency students succeeded, not thanks to, despite the system.
Right now, something else that Tim mentioned was putting the engagement as the premium up front.
Engage in, so that's experience, so to explain the phenomenon, doing, using. So let's think about the WIDA 2012, which is, in my thinking, real flip, just like a science standards. Why is that? Think about it. It's a limited English proficient trend traditionally, and English learners, I'm still learning English because English is the norm and I don't have English. To now, WIDA says multilingual learners. And it's really funny because according to ESSA, every student succeeds at ESSA uses English learners, but WIDA states there are 36 of them and 4 territories. They use multilingual learners. And I asked him, is that a problem? Is it causing trouble? And Tim says, nope. We just follow the federal legislation on one hand, and we use multilingual learners. This is what we have too. New York State Education Department, we have English language learners / multilingual learners, just like that. So it starts from multilingual learners, and then it will say multilingual learners are engaging in content learning using multimodality. By saying that, English language education is not junior to English language arts anymore, because English language arts is what? Speaking, listening, reading, and writing, and conventions of a language. It's all about language. WIDA says there are linguistic modalities of text and oral or speaking, but then there are non-linguistic modalities of diagrams and gestures and computational models and data, all of that beyond. I mean, can you think of doing math without thinking about non-linguistic of equations and symbols? Math, diagrams and figures. And now it's really hot. How do you represent hot temperature? By drawing red. When it's really, can you think of it? Environmental literacy, environmental justice, can you think of it? So WIDA uses, multimodality. And then I just mentioned that it used to be the science of defined static. And then it used to be the language of, really, the language of, according to the 2012, meaning that there is the language of science, meaning vocabulary and grammar, the language of. WIDA uses language for. Do you see that it's a language for, in the service of, language for a purpose, language for a function. Like that. So far, so good? Okay, it gets even better. So the WIDA 2020 says that across the content areas of English language arts, math, social studies, and science, students are engaging in, right? Students are engaging in ELA, engaging in math, engaging in So when students engage in it, it's not language, it's the students are doing, right? So WIDA says that students are doing. And in language, you could think of it as a genre. The students are arguing, students are explaining, students are communicating, students are planning. Now in science, it says the science practices, because this is what scientists do, what students do as a practices. It's also practices in math, practices in social studies. The students are doing practice. So they say that across the content areas that they identified for, it is a narrative. I think narrative is the influence of the English language arts to tell a story. Inform, it's inform, I informing. But then there are two that are so germane to content areas. Argue and explain, that apply to all. So it still has a little bit of influence from language arts of, I can think of forms of writing, the narrative writing, informational writing, expository writing, argument writing, like that. But those are kind. Students are doing content area learning, doing. And then once they get in, then it becomes a language. Then students are learning about language for a function, so language functions. Once students are doing, let's say, engaging in argument, they have to say they are learning about claim and evidence and reasoning. They are providing the data. These are language functions. Now, when they do the language function of making a claim, of providing the data as evidence, then they are using language features. Like there is, if it's a cause and effect, there is a because. But what they're doing is understanding the cause and effect, and there is a language of a because as a result. So that's how it goes. Language comes after what the discipline is. And then, so when I speak with the science educators and show them WIDA standards, the science educators will say, but that's what all students do. They have to use language when they argue. They have to use language to explain. So in that sense, WIDA 2020 applied to all students, which is the same as the science standards. The science standards are for all students, and language standards are for all students. Only later, it will say the students are doing science for the purpose, language functions and language features. And by the way, language functions and features at the word level, at the sentence level, and at the discourse level of a paragraph and beyond. Then we need to give a different scaffolding or language amplifications for different levels of proficiency. Language comes only at the end. And you can say that language amplification applies not only for multilingual learners, but all students.
Right. Now, I want to make a note of something that you also said in the podcast about WIDA. You said something to the effect that WIDA, which I just in case, I just want to make sure everyone understands. WIDA stands for World Class Instructional Design and Assessment. WIDA, you said that WIDA is going to be the glue in the future of language and content alignment. So do you still see this as the case, or do you think there's some new glue that's going to come onto the scene and really create that alignment that has been lacking for so long?
Boy, your questions are great. WIDA 2020 was released in December of 2020, and that's in the midst of the pandemic.
Right.
And we are still recovering from the pandemic, which has affected the minoritized groups of students more. I'm expecting that it'll take some time. If you think of it, just doing science to explain that garbage, or what happens to the plastic bottles I drink water from, that's a science. It takes time to flip that. It takes time from pre-teach and front-load language because Okhee does not speak English to Okhee brings ideas and it's a double. For that, I really give a credit for language education community to there's a double load, that there are standards, not just the science, but there are standards in ELA, math, social studies, and science. And then there are language proficiency development standards. So it's a double task. And it'll take some time. And if we can do science as explaining the phenomenon, making sense of, and if we can say that using language to do content learning, That's a huge improvement. And I would like to leave it there for the next several years, and just to try out what it works.
I like that you made this, that you said try out once again, because sometimes I think people don't realize that teaching is all about this. Yeah, teaching is all about trial and error. Just like when you were developing the curriculum, when any teacher is doing this, that's what it's all about. How are students reacting to this? What are some of the, I want to say, like the greatest accomplishments or benefits that have come from this mode of instruction or this way of approaching instruction as a whole. On that note, I would like to ask you what you think. We've been discussing this progression in terms of the WIDA standards and the science standards matching up, but would you say that this was the greatest moment of progression in terms of this integration? Or would you like to share maybe another moment that you think was really just a highlight in terms of bringing this concept forward?
Up to this point, I would say that it's not just science or STEM, but content areas and then language align for all students with a focus on multilingual learners is we are in a good place. And tryout is one way to think about. Another way to think about is that educators, and I fully agree and understand that even before the pandemic, the science educators will say, the science standards are very challenging. Do we have the capacity in the education system? And language education committees would say the same thing. Do we have the capacity to do the contemporary approaches? And when you combine the two together, educators may say that do we have the capacity and the resilience to be able to do it? And before the pandemic, I felt really sorry to say that I'm not a secretary of education and I cannot make the policy decision. I was joking. I felt really bad because I couldn't say. I just felt bad, and I don't know. I don't decide the education system and capacity. But through the pandemic and seeing the injustices, I would say that it is not an option. It is our chart. We just have to make it happen because we are going to lose many students, and we are going to lose particular groups of students. And when we say multilingual learners, that also applies to students with what we call disabilities, but students with diverse abilities, and students with economic challenges, all of those. So we just have to pull it through on behalf of the children. Yeah, and so let me say one other thing. Since you mentioned, are we in a good place? I would say I think we are in a good place as someone who was the troublemaker to push it this far. I think we're in a good place. But then where do we go next? That's the question.
Great. That's something great for our listeners to ponder. And a couple of the things that you just said reminded me of your speech. You made this really fantastically inspiring baccalaureate commencement speech, a keynote at Michigan State University. And you talked about some lessons that you learned. And a couple of the things that you just said are fully integrated into these lessons that you were giving the graduating class. So I definitely want to just share these lessons with our listeners. So the first one was do it. Don't ever leave yourself wondering what if. Now, what you just said about we just have to do it because there isn't really a choice here in terms of keeping our students, not losing our students, is what kind of made me say, oh, I definitely want to talk about some of these lessons. And then take care of yourself to take care of others. Put in the work, which is something that we have been talking about in terms of developing curriculums around these more contemporary ways of instruction, and then make your mark on the world, and finally be troublemakers, then be trailblazers. And
You
I think
got
that
that right.
that one is my favorite. So when you talked about being troublemakers and that bringing us this far to then become trailblazers and trying to figure out where we're going, right? What kind of trail are we blazing?
Thank you. So I am grateful to Rita to embrace my suggestions. The Rita 2012 is not right. Language should not be a dictator. Language in the service of communicating ideas. And then, so that's what Yasmin, I thought that I would be thrown out of the bus, but I'm accepted as a contributing member. And so that's the lesson that I learned of. When you have questions, chances are that other people will have the same questions. So ask. Asking a question, I consider that as an act of advocacy and act of activism. Mm-hmm. The second is that it's much easier to be quiet and silent, but if you have something to say, it's a little bit like in the station, train station. When you see something, say something. When you say something is right, say it because it's the right thing to do. So I consider that as activism, say it on behalf of, because someone has to say it, and that's a second. And then as you say it, other people will appreciate, so it's doing it, and it's being a troublemaker, but then you'll be a member of a community of people who have the same questions. And then you become the trailblazer.
Yeah.
It's honesty. It's a real honesty on behalf of those who deserve the assets recognized, and on behalf of those students who may not have the voice. So I say these things because I'm an Asian American woman, as a non-native speaker, as an immigrant, surrounded by the traditional science and science education community.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to name them, so the name wouldn't.
No.
There is all Sam, Jonathan, Bill, Phil, and Okhee. What? Like that. So that's my charge, and we should have to do that for students. Now so thank you so much. But there is one last comment that I would make about, so what would it be the next step to do? I said that we are in a good place, but we are not, we need to move forward. And I'm so glad that you said about the environmental literacy. When you talk about environmental, again, it hurts some people more than others, and it's a justice. Who gets hurt? Disproportionately. Plain English, during the pandemic, who died more? Which groups died? Which groups got hospitalized? Why? Who got the vaccine first? It's all justice issue. And it applies to today when it is over 90. Who is going to be hurting in the heat? Like that. So environmental literacy is environmental justice. So I'm thinking my recent proposal and our work with the funding from the National Science Foundation is the phenomena and the problems are not just the phenomena and problems in the science classroom, what we call sanitize the phenomena or problem. No, real problems and real phenomena. So in the garbage unit, we had, up to this point, we had what happens to our garbage from the school lunch garbage. I would have extended it to why do we have a landfill in some communities but not others? And that becomes environmental issue, and it is a justice issue.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, Okhee, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure that our listeners have as well. So please tell us where we can find more information about your work if there are some upcoming projects or publications that you'd like to make the audience aware of so that they can continue to follow the progress here.
Thank you for the questions. I'm not expecting you or anyone to read all the list of publications that I have done. And not all of them are good either, because I continue to learn and I'm re-educating myself, as we all do. Just like, it should have in the landfill more than garbage, like that.
Right.
Okay. I would say that we have all our instructional resources and what you said about the professional development and our emerging work on our website. It's a NYU SAIL Research Lab. That's one place I would say, because it's a repository of all the work that we have. The second is that I would like to ask the listeners to look into the New York State Education Department website that has that SAIL webinars and topic briefs. And it's really beautifully done. And some people may want to do those webinars and briefs for CTLE credits, for content areas, for multilingual learners. That's that. So that's the second. And the third is that I also have on my own profile of all the recent activities and work that I do, like Michigan State commencement speech and honorary doctoral degree. I was just blown away. On my personal website, which is okhele.com. So those are the 3 websites that we collect all our information and up and coming work. And then I'm hoping that Tanya and Yanira and Chris, so our current work with the OCMBOCES and Mid-State RBERN is that we are extending the garbage unit 5th grade, physical science, to the 2nd grade, lower. Mm-hmm. Our unit is how can you make a trail mix? Now, thinking about the peanut butter allergy, like that. And students are designing what container do you use? It's a students are learning about if you heat the chocolate from solid, it goes to liquid, but it is the same substance. The properties stay the same, like that. So 2nd grade students are learning. And then
this sounds fantastic. And you definitely need to start early. I mean, you know.
Exactly. The ideas are the same, just simpler ideas and simpler language, but it's the same idea. So 5th grade is a garbage of what happens to our garbage, which we hope to go to. Why do we have a garbage, the landfill in some communities than others? That's environmental justice. Now, 7th grade, the middle school goes more into what you would say. So it's why do we have so much plastic in drainage? We go into plastic pollution. And it goes into plastic pollution in the ocean all over the world. Now you can see here, I would like to make another comment about multilingual learners. So far we spoke about the multilingual learners are using language to do science. When you think about plastic pollution that affects the entire globe, then it suddenly becomes that multilingual learners who come from Haiti, who come from Thailand, are not immigrants or limited. They bring their own transnational knowledge and resources. That in Haiti, this is how we do. In Thailand, this is what we do. So it goes global. And then as they do the global data about the plastic pollution, they will be reading the data. So that gets into data science so naturally. And when they see the data science, they will say, how do we curb or flatten plastic pollution? What would be this computational models to say, this is what we need to do. And if you do this model, you flatten this much. And then they will do the engineering of, but we don't have the money. So how much do we need to flatten the plastic pollution? Do you see that the societal challenge like a plastic pollution, it just involves all STEM subjects, multiple. And it involves justice at the heart, at the core of the issue. So that's what we do in middle school. And then we go into high school of a vending machine of calculate all the chemistry using food from vending machine. And it can go into, again, the food desert. How do you design? So we are intentionally much more learning progressions of 2nd grade, 5th grade, middle school, and high school, but justice embedded in it, baked in.
Yeah, and I definitely love that it's going from like a local type of level and then just broadening to bring everybody together and just realize that we're all on this planet and we all need to understand how things work, etc. Right?
Exactly. So global it's a global citizenship, but the local is activism. If something is not right, the students will say, hey, this is not right.
Mm-hmm.
We need to correct the wrong. What can I do? So
Exactly.
Knowing beyond the science or engineering or STEM or doing beyond, it becomes informed citizens, responsible citizens to take
Right.
action.
Now, I'm going to ask one final question. Definitely, you have given us so much food for thought. You've thrown out a lot to make us think about and question just in general methodology, etc. So I will still ask the final question that I ask all of my lovely guests, which is what burning question should today's educators consider in order to improve their service to the L and ML community?
So I have two questions that build upon our conversation. And your response gave me even more ammunition when you said, why did it take so long? Because we think of it as a deficit. We have the norm, and anyone who does not meet the norm or criteria are limited. We have to shift the language. So my joke is that English is my second language, and Chinese was even earlier, and German. So I'm a multilingual learner. I'm not limited English proficient. So I say that asset-based language is my new second language or another language acquisition. I question everything that we say. So let me think about. We support multilingual learners. We say that we challenge students to think, persevere in solving math problems. We should challenge multilingual learners just like we support multilingual. Why do we always one direction, oh, you poor, you don't have? No, challenge them. That's one. Think about the language that we use and whether it is a deficit or essay. And that has dominated our discourse. And that's where you said, why did it take so long? Because we think that's one. And the second is that given these challenges that the society faces, and then the pandemic has exposed the injustices so glaringly, and then climate and pollution and food sustainability. So I am asking all of us to think beyond science or engineering or even STEM subjects into, so you think of, it's not the garbage from school lunch garbage. It is the landfill. It is the pollution that affects. And if we frame the question from the global or broad justice embedded, then it goes even one step further. So that's why I see that we are okay, but we're not good enough. We still need to go. And I'm so glad that you're speaking about the environmental lessons and how students were hesitant to, wow, it really applies to me. And can you imagine minoritized groups of students saying, that affects my family all the time. This is not right. We need to take action. And that's what I would like to see students doing. So instead of saying that students are not ready, they will. No, they should now. They can take action. They are informed and make responsible decisions now because it affects them.
Okay. All right. So it has been such a pleasure speaking with you today, Dr. Okhee Lee, on the Burning Questions podcast. And we definitely look forward to keeping up with your work and seeing how everything progresses.
I wanted to thank you for this opportunity to speak with you. And you asked really wonderful questions to keep our conversation going. So thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Our Burning Questions, produced by Mid-State RBERN at OCMBOCES. If you would like to learn more about today's guest or any of the resources we discussed, please visit Mid-State RBERN's webpage at OCMBOCES.org. That's OCMBOCES.org. Join us next time where we hope to answer more of your burning questions.